Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. Talli, last week you and I had a very interesting conversation with Eve Sachs and Yehudis Fletcher on a Facebook Live, which I also am posting as an Orthodox Conundrum podcast. It's about the issue of forced marriage in sectors of the Hasidic community and, to a lesser extent, in parts of the Haredi community. And some of what they talked about, or maybe all of what they talked about, was very disturbing. I recommend everyone listen to that interview either on Facebook or on the podcast. The problem is that it really is a narrow issue in the sense that the discussion really focused on the Hasidic community, but the issues that they raise can be broadened to people throughout the Orthodox and even beyond, because the issue of forced marriage, while technically being a very specific thing, raises the larger issue about consent in marriage and in sex, and it also raises the issue of how does someone even know if he or she is ready to get married in the first place?
So let's talk about the episode that we did, and let's invite our listeners to go to Orthodox Conundrum to hear the entire interview that you and I did with Yehudis Fletcher and Eve Sachs, who are two activists in the UK, and they explain how they are working towards identifying and acting to stop forced marriage, which is a very specific UK legal term.
Right, exactly. And that's why they use that term, actually.
And that's why they use that term. It is a very interesting interview that we would love for all of you to go and listen to. But today, what I thought would be really more relevant to our podcast is to talk about this issue, but in a way that feels relevant to our listeners who run the gamut of the spectrum of orthodoxy and who may feel very disconnected from the idea of forced marriage. What does that mean? What I thought we could talk about today was the idea of readiness for marriage and how much of it does feel coercive in the sense of, how do I know when I'm ready? What if the influencers in my community are telling me that I'm ready? How do I know that I'm ready for sexual behavior? What is consent? And I think that this is an issue. The issue of consent is being talked about a lot in all parts of society, in all parts of the world. And I think really understanding what consent means, what's the difference between explicit consent, implicit consent, what's the difference between consent as, okay, I agree, or enthusiastic consent. And I think that we have a lot to talk about in this episode about consent to be married as well as consent to engage in sexual relations.
Okay, we'll get there in just a moment. Please remember to go to intimatejudaism.com for all the podcasts that we put out, a Free Men's Mikvah list, show notes, and more. Also go to jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com, and make sure you become a Patreon supporter. The link is in the description of this podcast. Patreon supporters get bonus material, episodes, merch, and more, and it's a chance for people who have benefited from Intimate Judaism to support the podcast and the work that Talli and I do. So please consider becoming a patron. 2 weeks ago, we put out a question and answer session exclusively for Patreon subscribers. You'll enjoy that, so make sure you do that as well. And finally, send us your comments and questions to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Before we get into our main topic today, I want to first mention the 5 markers of forced marriage that Eve and Yehudis presented on that podcast. The 5 markers, they said, are a limited ability to opt out of the process. Second, a rushed engagement. Third, no or limited ability to meet or communicate after the engagement. 4, a binding engagement. This is called halachically the tanaim, particularly if there are financial penalties involved. And last, an expectation that you marry the person you're expected to, usually the person that you meet, that you're introduced to by your parents. So these are the 5 markers that they give. These are obviously very, very specific to sectors of the Hasidic world, maybe parts of the Haredi world. Many of us in other sectors of Orthodoxy don't do that. But I want to talk about the halachic issue involved here, because we know that halachic marriage must be by consent. The Rambam uses the language lirtzona. It has to be by the woman's agreement. She has to want to do this. And the question is, does this follow the halachic guidelines saying you're allowed to get married without consent, be forced to get married? So the short answer is, halachically, this is technically valid, because the legal definition of consent in halacha means that the woman knows what she's doing. She accepts the ring, even if she is being emotionally coerced, I find it hard to believe that that would be a halachic problem in this particular sense. That's point one, but that's the short answer. But it's a very, very misleading answer, because understanding the question of consent in the purely technical normative way, yes, she technically accepted the ring without someone putting a gun to her head. Okay, but halacha has to be understood in a much broader way, and this is an issue which I've talked about in other contexts, which is that halacha has both the technical legal requirements, and there also are the values that emerge from halacha, which we're supposed to follow and are supposed to guide our lives. We see this all the time. Halacha itself, and I'm going to say something which sounds controversial, but I believe is completely normative and regular, and Rashi says it, halacha itself is not inherently always ethical. I don't mean it's unethical, but what I mean is that halacha provides, in the words of Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, Zichrono Livracha, a floor as opposed to a ceiling of morality. It's the starting point. Let me use this as an opening example. Parshat Ki Tetzei begins with 3 consecutive mitzvot. The first one is the Eshet Yifat Toar. This refers to a man who is in war and sees a captive enemy woman, and he wants to marry her. He falls in love with her beauty, and the Torah gives very specific prescriptions of what he must do before he does that. Wait 30 days, shave her hair, etc. The next mitzvah talks about a man who has 2 wives, one wife who's beloved and one wife who is hated, or perhaps more accurately, not loved in the same way as the first wife. And each wife has a son, and the father is not allowed to give the right of the firstborn to the son of the beloved wife if the other wife's son is older. And the third mitzvah is ben sorer umoreh, the rebellious son who is brought to the court by his parents when he's young, and he is put to death. And Chazal explain the reason, because certain telltale signs of what he has done indicate that this person will inevitably be a bandit and a murderer. Therefore, Chazal explain the mitzvah, we put him to death before he does that terrible action so that he dies innocent, and of course, society won't have to deal with a murderer running around in its midst. 3 mitzvot, the first 3 mitzvot of the parsha with the most mitzvot in the Torah. And Rashi says, why are they adjacent to each other? Because if you do the first mitzvah, if you are a person in war who marries this captive woman, that will lead to the second one. You'll have one beloved wife, you'll have one hated wife. In other words, that will lead to serious family dysfunction. And if you do the second mitzvah of having 2 wives, one beloved, one not beloved, and you have to give the right of the firstborn to the son of the hated wife, you're going to end up with a ben sorer umoreh, a rebellious son. What Rashi means in indicating that that's the connection, the thematic connection between these 3 mitzvot, is that, yes, these are 3 mitzvot in the Torah. And yet, don't do them. They are not something you're supposed to do. They're in some ways the ultimate b'diavad, the thing that after the fact, if you have to do it, this is the way you do it. If you end up with a beloved wife and a hated wife, that's awful. And if each one has a son, in this case, unfortunately, you have family dysfunction. This is how to manage it. You have to give the right of the firstborn to the older son, not the son whose mother you like more. Ben sorer umoreh, of course, Chazal say in Masechet Sanhedrin, at least according to one opinion, that it never happened and never will happen. But that whole idea is not an ideal situation. This is a terrible situation. The captive wife, Rashi also quotes Chazal as saying, this is only for someone who's overcome with his evil inclination. This is not a good thing. We see here an example where the Torah gives 3 things. They're listed among the 613 mitzvot. And yet, don't do them. No, this is bad. This should not happen. If you see a woman who's a captive, don't go and marry her. This is only if you're stuck and you feel completely overwhelmed with temptation. This is the way you have to do it, but it's a terrible idea. The Torah, again, is giving us a floor. The bottom line ethical minimum, not necessarily where we're supposed to reach. The Torah will often give us certain halachot, but we also have halachic values that emerge from it. And those halachic values that emerge should be the source of a greater ethical sensitivity than perhaps the minimal law requires. I think that any case where there's a woman who is forced to marry technically gives consent, but doesn't give emotional consent, and you'll define consent soon for all of us, but she's not really ready for this. It's not something that she wants. That's an example of, okay, you fulfilled the technical requirement, but it's completely unethical. Something can be ethically obscene and at the same time be within the dictates of Torah, and at the same time not be a Torah way of thinking. Torah's dictates give us a starting point. there are also values that emerge from that, which we're supposed to try and implement. So in our case specifically, the idea that a woman has to give consent, technically, I think can be extended to say that the idea of consent is a value. Consent is something we want her to have. And therefore, even if she has a technical way of defining consent, that's the same way that the ketuvah gives the technical requirements of the marriage, but a marriage is not the ketuvah. The marriage is much more than the technical requirements. You have to feed your wife, you have to have sexual intercourse with your wife, you have to give her clothes. That's not a marriage. That's the technical requirements. A woman who gives consent is technically following the halacha, but if she's not giving authentic full consent, you are violating halachic values. There's a law called yibum, levirate marriage, where if someone dies without any children, his brother marries the widow. Technically, the way that yibum works is the brother goes to the widow and has sex with her. That's how the marriage happens. But Chazal said that you have to do it through something called ma'amar, which is basically a marriage. It's a wedding, effectively. You have to have something that is a wedding, that looks like a wedding, in order to preserve the widow's dignity. As opposed to the guy just going and having sex with her, which technically works, even afterwards. It technically works, but if a guy does it that old-fashioned way, he gets lashes. Let me say it again to be clear. By Torah law, the way that yibum occurs is for the brother to have sex with the widow. That's it. They're now married. That's the end. By rabbinic law, if the brother does that, if he does what the Torah says he should do, without first doing this ceremony called ma'amar, which Chazal instituted, he gets lashes by rabbinic decree because we care deeply about dignity. Dignity is a moral value. Once again, this relates to the idea of consent. Not allowing someone to truly consent is a violation of dignity. Dignity we see across Torah is a very, very important value. Ma'amar is just one of many examples of preserving a person's dignity. I know I'm being a bit indignant about this, but I think it's important that we say something can be halachically valid and at the same time be completely against Torah values.
So I'm going to reframe what you're saying because I don't think that it's about the Torah not necessarily being ethical or the laws of the Torah not necessarily being ethical. The way that I see it, and I love the examples that you gave, are that those laws were actually very progressive and very protective of women for the time. And the reason why what I'm going to say will also sound, even though it sounds like I'm defending, and I'm defending the Torah, but I'm also saying something even more controversial, which is that many of the laws which were extremely important and relevant to the time where women did not have the same equal standing in society are no longer relevant today. So just about every example you gave, take the Eshet Yafat Toar. What autonomy did she have? And in fact, the person who falls in love with her doesn't get to just take her and marry her. He has to wait. That's the whole idea. He has to shave her head and he has to wait. And by the way, this also gives him a message, which is a very important Torah value, that you don't get to do just whatever you want without taking a bit of time, reflecting, seeing her without her beautiful head of hair, and then decide if you want to marry her. Then what you said about the two Bechor sons from two different wives, again, these are laws that are put in place to protect the mothers, to protect the wives. I remember one time my father, Zatzal, saying to us about Shiloh HaKen, and he was making fun of a bunch of yeshiva boys that were running around looking for the opportunity to do this wonderful mitzvah.
To chase away the mother bird, right.
To chase away the mother bird. But of course, the mitzvah is in place to teach, if you are in a situation where you need to take those little birds, you should first have mercy. But it's not telling you that you should go running around chasing away mother birds. I mean, that's ridiculous. So obviously, if we understand that the Torah laws are there to protect the underdog in a way, the person who doesn't have rights, that in fact, it's not about the Torah not necessarily being ethical. It was ethical for that time. But today, it's actually can be used in ways that are very unethical.
Thank you for clarifying that, Talli, because I don't want anyone to misunderstand me to think that I'm saying that the Torah isn't ethical. That is not what I mean. What I mean is that the Torah often gives, as I said, an ethical floor, the minimal ethical requirements. And as you're pointing out correctly, sometimes those ethical requirements in a particular context is very ethical. If a person is overwhelmed and he's going to rape a woman, and if you can get him to wait 30 days and then marry her properly, well, that obviously is much more ethical, so to speak, than what he was planning on doing. But if the person does that as a l'katchila, his ideal way of doing things, that's certainly unethical. So in case anyone misunderstood, I'm
meaning
agreeing
that
with you.
we need a new set of ethics for today.
Or I'd say that I think the term I use, that this was the ethical floor. It's not that it's unethical inherently. This is a floor from which we grow to higher levels of ethics. Nowadays, I think that we would understand if a person's in war and there is a captive woman there, he shouldn't take her no matter what, even waiting the 30 days. This is not appropriate. Given the ethical assumptions of the world in which Am Yisrael existed 3,000 years ago, this was ethically progressive in an extreme way. And I think it's fair to say that Hashem, this is the Rambam's approach about many of these laws, that there's only so far Hashem can take Am Yisrael before the system will break. They're not ready necessarily to say, captive women are released, etc., without any opportunity for a person to have his way with her in any context. And nowadays, we would say, we've grown from that because the Torah itself gave us the basic value, as you said, that you have to wait. It can't be about her beauty. It has to be an authentic relationship, and so on and so forth. So we can say the value implicit in that mitzvah is very, very good, even though nowadays to actually implement that mitzvah would be a big mistake, as Rashi himself says. So in case anyone misunderstood me, I'm not saying the Torah is unethical, God forbid. That's not what I mean. I mean that implementing it as it says nowadays would be unethical given the way that we've grown as the Torah itself taught us to do.
I think also that we need to recognize, I mean, there are a lot of sayings in the Talmud that really don't feel ethical. They feel like whatever was going on then, we know a lot more now. For example, the passage that says if you have sex with a 3-year-old or your rapist has to marry you, obviously with your consent, but it's to protect you because if you were raped, then your value was completely diminished. So again, these things...
Can I give you a good example of what's interesting about the Talmud itself struggling with that particular issue? What's funny is that, I don't know if it's funny, but it's interesting. In that case you're giving, it's Masechet Kiddushin, saying that if a person has sex with a 3-year-old, it's technically sex, and technically she can get married that way. But the Gemara itself says, but don't you dare do it. That's terrible. No. You're not allowed to. If the father gives his 3-year-old or 3 to 12-year-old daughter over to this husband to get married through sex, no, that's not allowed. The fascinating part is that Tosfot, who lived 1,000 years later in Germany, say, why is the Gemara against this? We all do this nowadays. How can we be going against the Gemara?
Yeah.
In other words, the moral assumptions of those days had gone to a different place. They say the Gemara says you're not allowed to, don't you dare, and yet we do it. And Tosfot explains that, well, nowadays people die so young, if they don't get married that young, then they simply can't get married or whatever it is. But it's interesting to see how the Gemara is going in a certain moral direction. 1,000 years later in Germany, things had changed and societies had changed, and they're trying to struggle with the Gemara's strong morality against what they do and saying, how are we allowed to justify this?
So that brings us really to our conversation about consent, because one of the things that I had said in the Zoom that we did in the Facebook Live was that in my clinical experience with the Hasidic population is often the problems arise when they do begin to be exposed to modern Western societies, where they see that other women get a choice or other women get to meet with their chatanim, or they hear about things that they wouldn't have known about. And this has a lot to do with the not changing culture, with the culture that continues to see women the way women were, which is property. They also see their children that way. And so the values of personal autonomy are not very high in those societies. So the idea that you should get to choose who you want to marry, or that you should be able to decide if that person is compatible by going through some process of increasing intimacy with that person, that's not a value. The value is we're your parents. We know what's right. We know the kind of guy or the kind of girl that you should marry, and you need to be able to trust us. And trust is a very big factor because that's what helps the system work.
So would that be called consent if someone trusts the parents?
Well, again, when you asked about the definition of consent, I don't think it would necessarily be a criteria for consent. Consent is about being informed. I mean, informed consent is about being informed. And so if you're somebody who doesn't know anything, if you don't even know about birth control, so you don't even know that you're necessarily going to get pregnant right away if you don't take any birth control, if you don't have the basic right, the basic human right for being assertive and saying what you want or what you don't want because you have been told that that's not within your right, that's not really consent. So I think that it's important, super important, the work that Nachamu, which is the organization that Eve and Yehudis founded, and they're doing this important work on forced marriage. But I really wanted to bring this conversation to make it relevant, because I don't think that most of the listeners here are going to necessarily relate to the idea of forced marriage. But I can tell you that many, many young couples who I have seen really did not know each other and really were not sure about what they were doing, and that there was quite a bit of, I don't want to say forcing or coercion, but I do want to say that many of them got married through a process of a great deal of positive encouragement and pushing it through. That is not uncommon. Once in a while, I'll get a phone call from a very anxious kala teacher, and she'll say to me, I don't know what to do. I've got a kala, and she's so scared of getting married, and her wedding is in 2 weeks, and I have to get her prepared, and she's just so scared, and she can't do a bedika, and she does, and she keeps on throwing up, and I'm thinking, come on, like, why? So why is she getting married? Sometimes it's ridiculous answers too,
Can you give some examples?
She has some cognitive disability and they found somebody who's very good for her, or the one underneath her wants to get married, and so she has to hurry up and get married so the one underneath her can get married. There's something in the family and we want to hurry up and get her married before it gets found out. And this, to me, definitely falls under the categories that Yehudis and Eve are talking about. But that's more extreme. I'm talking about young women who want to get married because they want to be a kala. They want to kind of conform to the society in which they live. They're not rebellious, or they're not LGBT, which, by the way, falls under the category of forced marriage. When you have a guy who goes to his Rebbe and says, look, I think I'm attracted to men. I think I might be homosexual. And he says, just get married.
And it'll all be okay.
Yeah, that's considered one of the criteria because it's not part of your orientation.
So now you're talking about a situation that you could have a situation where it could be the young man or woman wants to get married. The parents aren't even encouraging it necessarily, but it still could be way before they're ready because they're whatever pressures they put on themselves or societal.
Social pressures.
Right, social pressures.
Or, their two best girlfriends got engaged, so they want to get engaged. So I'm not talking about the situations that Yehudis and Eve are talking about. I'm talking about situations that we encounter.
It's much more relatable.
Much more relatable. How do I know if I'm ready? How do I know if I am indecisive, if I am feeling unsure, if I don't know if she's the right one or he's the right one? How do I know? These are the directions that I'd like to go in.
Let us know. How does somebody know if a young man or woman is engaged or thinking about getting engaged? And I teach chatanim. I've seen this all the time that they're not sure, that whatever, before they get engaged, perhaps, and perhaps afterwards. When is that just normal butterflies? This is a big life decision, maybe the biggest decision, probably the biggest decision of your life. How do I know, or how does somebody know that, no, this is something which it's fine, just work through it? And how does someone know that this is something which really he or she should be concerned about? Sometimes, for example, someone might be really nervous about getting married to the point that someone would say, don't get married, you're too nervous. But that person just has a fear of commitment, as they say. And the person's great for him and they love each other and they have a wonderful time. But the idea of being with this person for his life, he freaks out and runs away. Is that what he's supposed to do?
Well, that's a different issue. I mean, that's a different issue. I mean, there are people
who manifest as butterflies, same problem.
Right. No, but I mean, there are people who really do have a problem with decision making. They have some anxiety. And there's also something called relational OCD, which is very specific to relationships. The idea that people have a lot of indecisiveness because they're very indecisive about many, many other things, that needs to be weeded out, which is one thing that I, as a therapist, would do. Is it context, or is it content, or is it process? I'm not talking about somebody who is just unable to make decisions.
All right.
I'm really talking more about how do we make those decisions. Somebody posted on Facebook something about how you should marry your children off very young while they're still innocent and don't have, rigid expectations. They'll just go along with anything. And there were a lot of comments about that. But I continued reading, and it said in Yiddish something like, they should be young enough so they care about the ringale and not the ingale. It's not so important who the boy is. They just want the nice ring.
And it sounds like a healthy attitude.
Yeah, really. So I thought about the idea of he, she, or it. When you're Hatan or you're Kala, to you is an it. Really, you don't know that person. It's my Kala. It's my Hatan. It's kind of like a little tiny baby that, sometimes you say it, give me it. Because it's an object, really, until you have a relationship. People are objects until they become subjects. So unfortunately, what happens a lot is that the subjective nature of the relationship isn't valued as much as the objective nature, which means, he's the best learner, comes from a good family, she did 2 years of Sherut Lumi instead of 1 year. I mean, this is already taking it to the more modern, but just to show that a lot of times ticking the boxes feels more important, at least externally. So
than that connection, feeling that emotional connection.
Right. So I'm talking more about, do we have a connection? Do we know each other? Do I see this person as a person and not just as my boyfriend or my fiance or my
opportunity to get married?
Or my opportunity to get married. People talk about capability for consent. If somebody who you work for wants to have sex with you, how do you know that you've really consented if you're afraid that you're going to lose your job? We talk about the capability to consent. So first of all, do I have the capability? And so the question is, do I have the capability, for example, to be assertive about what I want? So, one example would be somebody who came to me and said, I should have known that I wasn't in a position to get married, because when we would go out on dates, he would always order for me. And he would order things that I didn't like. Like one time, we even on our first or second date, he didn't ask me what I wanted. He just ordered a Diet Coke for me. And, I didn't want a Diet Coke. I wanted a real Coke. I don't drink Diet Coke. Why did he think that? Probably his chassan teacher told him that all girls drink diet drinks. And maybe that's why. But the thing is that I was too embarrassed. Are you able to say to a guy that you're going out with, no, I don't want that? No, I don't like that. So that's really basic. And that's also basic to your own knowledge of your own self. Do you know enough about yourself? Do you know enough about, are you able to articulate your own values? Or do you say to yourself, okay, whatever my partner wants, I'll go along with it? Because the truth is that even though the article that I was referring to before says the more innocent you are and the less you know about yourself, the better. The truth is the more you know about yourself, the better, because otherwise you're not able to give your partner clear messages about what you want or don't want. It's like the old pizza example.
What's the pizza example?
The pizza example?
No, I don't know the pizza
example.
example.
They use the pizza example like for sex. Like, how do you know what your partner wants in sex? So they say, well, when you have pizza, when you're going to have a pizza with your date and they want to order, what do you like on it? You say, well, I like mushrooms on it, but I don't like onions. It's the same thing. Like, you need to be able to talk to your partner about what you like and what you don't like. So if your partner orders a pizza and they say, Erev Pesach, there's nothing in the house. And then you say, I don't care, whatever you want. So the guy says, okay, fine, I'll just get whatever I want. And then he gets a pizza and you don't want to eat it because he put pineapples on it, which is a really weird thing that they do in Israel.
Yeah, I don't get that at all.
Put pineapples on a pizza and tuna.
That's a different podcast topic. Why they're thinking in pizza.
Why they put pineapples and tuna on pizza in Israel. But then you find out that you shouldn't have said anything you want, and then you don't eat the pizza, and then your partner's like, I thought you wanted pizza. Again, the analogies.
Right. I understand it's a metaphor. Well. It sounds like you're presenting being assertive as a value. Sometimes a person doesn't like being assertive. The person is more comfortable obliging and saying, I feel more myself when I make you happy. I realize that's sort of an extreme way of putting it, but sometimes a person doesn't want to be assertive, and that's not a bad thing. It's just the person's personality. I'm good with what you want. I'm okay. I don't really care in this case.
Okay. I mean, look, I think that that's fine as long as they're choosing that behavior.
They don't feel stifled by it. They're doing it by choice.
Right, because this is part of their identity. I'm one of these really, we call it Zorem here in Israel. I'm one of
go
these
with the flow.
Really chill people. I go with the flow. It really doesn't matter to me that much. But when something does matter, that's when
we all have those things. We all have our lines.
Everybody has those things. So that would be one thing. And there's really many other things in terms of just intimacy. Have you ever had a conflict? And how did you resolve the conflict? Too many partners early on, they show each other only their best sides. And so this is where the system comes in. Because sometimes the system comes in and says, don't talk about these subjects or don't tell him these things. And this is also that kind of nuance between, not actually being a forced marriage, but the outside influencers in the couple, whether it's the shadchanim or the rabbi or the Beis Yaakov teacher or whoever is involved or the mother, dictates what they should or shouldn't talk about or when they are or aren't ready to get engaged, whether it's 4 dates or 5 dates. And what's missing is the opportunity to build trust, be able to tell something to a partner, have them hold that secret for you, the opportunity to resolve conflict, to know each other's triggers, to see each other like in different situations where one might get upset or one might lose their temper, see them with other people. And when marriages are kind of pushed through very quickly, which they often are, these things don't get to happen. So I think this is taking that whole aspect of forced marriage and bringing it down a few notches, because obviously it's not forced marriage, but how are these things really applicable to our societies?
But I'm a little bit confused about something that you said. When you talk about seeing each other in situations that might make you upset or angry and seeing the real person underneath the facade that everyone presents on a date, is that really so necessary? Obviously, on one level, that's great. You get to see if this person handles it the way that I would want him to handle it or the way that I would want her to handle it. But on the other hand, people know when they're going on a date. I don't mean hold back about what you talk about. That's not what I'm talking about. But obviously, you're putting your best foot forward. You're going to shower first, even though maybe you're not as careful all the time. You're going to wear better clothes, perhaps, than you would otherwise. You're going to try to be more polite than you would be at home necessarily. Who knows? But the point is that everyone knows, and they're going in with the assumption is, I am seeing this person at his or her best, or at least at his or her better than normal. That's kind of what dating means. The person's putting the best foot forward. And as long as I understand that's the case, do I really have to start finding all these situations where a person can, mess up? Like there was an apocryphal story many years ago that used to be going around. It's almost a joke that a couple's driving somewhere in Manhattan and the girl reaches over at a red light and just pulls the keys out of the guy's ignition. And the car is stopped there. And then, of course, Manhattan, light turns green and cars are beeping. They're going crazy. And for 3 cycles of red light, green light, she just sits there and he just sits there. He does not say one word. Finally, after the 3rd cycle, she gives him back the keys and says with a big smile, "Congratulations, you just passed my test." And he says, "Yeah, but you just failed mine." I don't believe this story. It's obviously apocryphal. At the same time, though, do we really need to do that kind of thing? Do we really need to see how someone reacts in a situation like that? Because it's so artificial.
Look, when you get engaged to somebody and you're going to marry them, this is your life. This is the rest of your life. You want to know that this person is somebody that you can respect, and you want to know how this person responds to stress, and you want to know how this person responds to distress. What's their tolerance for distress? What are their ways in which they cope? Not because you're trying, and I'm not saying that you need to set up situations. I'm saying that organically these situations happen because that's life. I think that everybody kind of finds out things because, we don't live together with our partners for the most part before we get married. I mean, there might be some listeners on this who do, and that's fine. I'm not saying anything negative about that, but I think that, the mainstream Orthodox world, you don't live together. So there are going to be surprises. And amongst those surprises may be that, you don't smell that good all the time. And these are all things that can obviously be dealt with. But if you marry somebody who, has a very dysregulated temper or can tend to really put you down, if you don't have the opportunity to see those red flags, and you're not given the opportunity because you aren't informed about what to look for, again.
Or because 4 dates is considered enough, and that's it.
Because 4 dates is considered enough. Look, even Yehudis's point was a lot about education. And, what they were saying is that once you are educated, then you can make more informed decisions. But obviously, in the demographic that they're talking about, they're dealing with very difficult norms to change. I mean, they're obviously not going to, I don't know how quickly the Haredim are going to allow sex education into their schools.
Right.
But I think that on some level, throughout the spectrum of Orthodoxy, we cannot expect a couple to make a decision about marriage if they don't know the most basic information. And some of them really don't. And I do definitely see this in my Hasidic patients, that they knew nothing. They only learned about how to even have sex or what sex is on the day of the wedding. And there certainly is what to say about the rape culture here. The idea that, you have to have sex, you don't know anything about sex, you're married to a perfect stranger who you just met for 20 minutes. This is a culture of rape, unfortunately. And I think that if we nuance that to some extent, we might find that messages such as, you have to have sex or else your husband's going to go somewhere else or he's going to spill seed or,
right.
These are nuances of that same extreme message. So we need to be really careful, even though we're all, modern and more liberal than that, obviously, we still need to be careful of the messages that are based on that assumption that, unfortunately, these are messages that are heard very, very strongly in certain cultures, but we're also still hearing parts of that even today when we talk about sex as an obligation and when we talk about how it's a chesed. I think I just saw an article about a woman who was told that even though her husband was beating her, the rabbi said it's a chesed to still go to the mikvah. Like, you should still go. It's a chesed. Like, that is a culture of rape. That's a culture of non-consent.
Well, it's another example of where rabbis are not staying in their lane, where they have no idea about anything about therapy. They don't know what they're talking about. And they're making ridiculous assumptions and ridiculous pronouncements in places where they have absolutely no right to do so, never mind the education to do so. It's crazy.
Yeah. I gave a lecture once, and afterwards a woman came over to me and said that her husband had an affair, and the day that she found out about her husband's affair was mikveh night. And she called her rabbi to ask him, what do I do? And he said, you have to go. It's mikveh night.
You have to go, of course.
Yeah, you have to
Right.
go. And it's mikveh night. She says, well, I don't really feel like being with my husband because he had an affair and I'm angry at him right now. And he said, well, look, you're obligated. And,
That's rape culture. That's rape culture right there.
Yeah. But this was a Chardal lady. She was Haredi Dati Lumi. She wasn't even like a Hasidic lady. And this is the message that she got.
One of the things I think was Yehuda said was, I don't know what it was that the woman was, maybe if she doesn't have sex with her husband anytime he wants. I don't remember the exact phrase. You can listen to the podcast. But the rabbi told her, in that case, you can do what you want, but don't blame him when he goes off and has an affair with somebody else. Basically taking away, among other things, the husband's agency to say he's just an animal. He's going to do what he has to do. And it's your job to keep him in line. That's all part of the same culture you're describing.
Right. And then when we talk about obligation and when we talk about consent, I feel remiss to not mention the idea of sex as connection, as pleasure, as a place to build, as a place to construct and not destruct. And when sex is used in a destructive way like that, that really just causes a great deal of distress to individuals and to couples. And unfortunately, as we just talked about, it is often misguided by rabbis and by people in the position of power. So if people in position of power are telling you to have sex, then that's non-consensual. And in the Hasidic community where there's like an askan who might be telling a young couple when they should be having sex.
Like a community leader, in other words, yes.
Kid you not, yeah. I did work with a couple who I didn't understand who he was, and they said, well, he's the askan for the couple. And he decides when, the idea of sex as being consensual was not really ever part of the contract. As a matter of fact, the opposite was.
Lo ba b'cheshbon, as they say. Wow. Before we close up, I want to mention we're recording this about 10 days before Pesach. And I was thinking in preparing for this episode about how we call Pesach Zman Cherutenu, the time of our freedom. And
ironically.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's interesting because I know people are going to say yes, but it says Masechet Avot in the 6th Perek. The Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that the only person who's free is somebody who's involved in Torah. But that doesn't mean that freedom isn't a value. When he says that, what he means is that if you're not involved in Torah, you're going to be involved in something else. Torah allows you to have the freedom to know there's something other than your natural drives that allows you to choose which way you're going to live your life. Freedom itself, the fact that we say, we have to say in terms of a value, freedom is a value. Consent is an expression of freedom. And as long as we either explicitly, like in the cases that Yehudis and Eve mentioned, deny consent, or implicitly, in so many of our communities, limit someone's consent, there is a big problem that we have to address, and we're violating that concept that we celebrate on Pesach. There is an element of being free. Yes, we believe as Orthodox Jews that halacha is normative, something which God gave us to follow. That doesn't mean there's no concept of consent at all, and a person can be told by other people, rabbis, parents, anyone, what they must do. And once you get into the most private areas of their lives in the bedroom, although again, halacha says there's certain things one has to do, halacha never says, though, that consent isn't necessary. Again, that idea that I mentioned earlier, lirtzona, she has to agree and he has to agree. If they're not comfortable, halacha is not demanding it. Talli, one of the most common comments that we get among the people who write to us is that they were so shocked, but so happy to hear that having sex the first night of marriage is not an obligation. You can wait if you're not ready. And that was something which, before we did this podcast, I never would have realized was such a big issue. But we hear it over and over again. People need to know that consent is a Jewish value, that if you're not ready, don't do it, and don't let anyone force you into doing something you're not comfortable with. I'm writing a book now for Chatanim as they prepare for marriage. And I believe it's 3 times that I write in boldface, marital rape is rape, spousal rape is rape. Because even though, so to speak, we all know this, people need to be reminded that consent is a real thing. It really matters. And anytime someone doesn't have consent, doesn't have the ability to consent, even if it's implicit, we have to overcome that.
So here's a message to everybody who listens and to Chatanim teachers and Kala teachers. Let's put consent into the conversation of premarital education. Also, not to mention sex education for children and for teenagers, not just talking about shomer negia, but also talking about consent. Let's also put consent in the conversation when we talk about hadracha, when we talk about guidance before marriage. And let's not assume consent, because I think that what we have been learning is that it's not assumed. One of our very first podcasts where we talked about, anything a man wants to do with his wife, he can do. I think you had talked with Yaakov Shapiro earlier about his book, Halachic Positions. And he also mentions in the book, look, I can't just not say anything about the fact that it doesn't really have a female voice and that consent is implicit. And again, I think that we don't really know, because there are way too many ways to violate that implicit consent, and it is violated on a social macro level. And so we do need to actually make explicit consent into a value. And also understanding the difference between consent because you not allowed to say no, consent that is informed, consent that is enthusiastic. This is what I really want. It's not just, okay, fine, I'll let you, but this is what I really want to do.
And just to conclude, you mentioned teenagers, but also children. I think that's so important. A few days ago, I talked to Rabbi Yaakov Horowitz from Muncie about the situation with Yehuda Meshi Zahav and the idea of child abuse. And let's not forget that these conversations, as difficult as it is and as uncomfortable as they are not just with kids who are 20, 25, people who are getting ready to get married. Not even only with teenagers, even younger children have to be taught the concept and values of consent, that my body belongs to me, there is good touch and bad touch, but consent, my body is my own, that is an important value which has to be taught at the youngest ages in order to ensure that, chas v'shalom, terrible things don't take place.
Great. Thanks so much for that.
Okay, thank you everybody for listening to this episode. We wish you all a Chag Kasher v'Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everybody.